Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 10, The Retail World in Turmoil episode. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
We have a special edition episode for the people here today. If you're as much a fan as I am of perfect alliteration, you're going to love this episode. We are focusing on 10 tantalizing tips for tumultuous times. Steve, on a scale of tumultuousness, where do you rate the times we're in and what retailers are dealing with now?
Well, I guess with my more recent benchmark being COVID times, say being a 10, I would have said 8 maybe. But maybe the last week or two has made me get it back up to 9. So pretty darn high. And I think the degree of, like, at least, I mean, obviously COVID was quite different from the types of impacts it had. You know, we're not talking about people dying and being deathly ill and all that kind of stuff. But at least there was a point at which I think we could see a trajectory forward with COVID, whereas, you know, just every day seems to be a different day. Every hour sometimes seems to be a different hour when it comes to the tariff piece of this anyway. So it's quite volatile. And I think, you know, it's really causing people to get more short-term focused than is desirable. But in many cases, I think that's just the world we're in, and it's what's necessary.
Well, as a comic, in all seriousness, this is going to be a great episode for thinking through some things that you should be thinking through as we go through the times we're in. So we'll get to that, of course, after the news. Now, we're back after a very brief hiatus. Steve, you're back from a tour of Italy locations, it looks like, from your Instagram thoughts. You were in Italy, right? Like amazing.
Yes, I was in Sicily for 10 days, and then I spent a few days in Milan and Lake District there, Lake Como. And it was really a great trip, and I'm mostly unplugged from the world, but, you know, a few things did drag me back in, but watched virtually no television, which was very good for my mental health, because the more you watch television, you are likely to run into the news, some of which we will get into. But I did feel like I had to stay a little bit connected, just, you know, to be able to do this particular thing. But it was a really great trip. You know, it's really, I guess one thing I will say kind of in the broader retail context, you know, Milan is obviously a big city. People who've been there will know. Just a ton of shopping. It's like quite extraordinary, and a lot of particularly luxury and fashion brands that people would recognize. But when you get to Sicily, which is you know, a lot of smaller towns and smaller cities and not a lot of international retailers, it's just interesting to see how shopping exists, much more relaxed pace, much more artisanal, I guess, for lack of a better term. And it was really interesting pace. People really passionate about what they're doing, not quite so corporate. Nothing against being corporate, but it helps pay the bills here. But yeah, it was a kind of interesting contrast.
Well, I'm sorry to have to drag you back, so to speak, into the news, and you know, let's get into the news because there's a lot to cover on any given day. But let's start with where we must: tariff turmoil. What's looking back from Europe back to America, observing what's happening. Give us a quick summary from what you think and what it's all adding up to.
Well, I keep hoping each episode that we'll have to talk less about this, but somehow maybe we need to talk a little bit more about it. I really did hope coming back that some things would settle. You know, the Trump administration said they wanted to do 90 deals in 90 days, and we are now, 60 plus days into this. And even if you give the administration credit for kind of a sort of deal with the UK, there are no other deals being done as far as we can tell. So, but we also
does that jet though? Does that jet count as a deal? The jet?
Well, it's a different kind of deal. So, kind of my headline for this was just when you thought things couldn't get any more uncertain, they seem to have. One of the things that happened last week, which I imagine most of our listeners would have heard about, is that a court in the United States found that the tariff policies of the Trump administration are not legal, that he overstepped his authority as the president, and it's an authority that's really vested with the Congress. Now, when these were first announced, I remember a lot of commenting, without getting into the weeds too much on, U.S. politics, because I know we have lots of international listeners. But the basic thing was that a lot of folks did comment that it didn't seem like Trump could do this legally because of the way the law and the Constitution is written. But then we just kind of moved ahead, and people really didn't bring that up. And I think that largely has to do with the Congress being controlled by the Republicans, standing with Trump rather than kind of stepping up to the plate. But anyway, various lawsuits sort of wound their way through the court, and a court overturned or ruled that the tariffs are not legal. Now we have a stay on that. So anyway, I think we will be in legal gyrations here for a bit of time. I think this will ultimately go to the Supreme Court. But it turns out, again, without getting into the weeds, there are several other ways around some of the tariffs that the administration could lean on. One example is federal law does allow the president to impose tariffs up to 15%. So that would be more than 10%, which is on most countries right now, for up to 150 days in situations where imports exceed exports to a degree deemed a crisis. Now, the Trump administration on many things has been leaning on calling something a crisis when it's not. For example, deportation policy supported by us supposedly being invaded by Venezuela, which is kind of silly. So anyway, the net of this is it's one more thing in the mix that will keep things volatile and uncertain and confusing. My guess is that most retailers and most countries will basically assume that we are living under the current status quo and proceed accordingly, until which time either some deals actually happen, but of course, various deadlines are coming up. So anyway, more craziness. I guess a couple other things I'll mention really quickly is Trump has said he wants to increase tariffs on steel and aluminum from 25% to 50%. He's been threatening Apple and others for certain behavior. So who the hell knows where this is all going to go. But my favorite thing that happened while I was gone in terms of being amusing is this new term, which I'm sure many people have heard by now, is the so-called taco trade, which stands for Trump always chickens out, which we have talked about in terms of his tendency to change his mind a lot and negotiate with himself. So anyway, stay tuned. Next week's episode, we'll get into some of this in a little bit more detail, and perhaps a few things will be more clear, but at this point, I would guess probably not.
Well, let's move off from the world of tariffs into the world of results. Lots of them coming through. Hit the highlights with some of the big ones that sent you a signal of sorts.
Well, yeah, with 2 weeks in news to cover during a time when we had lots of earnings, it would take quite a lot of time to go through all of them, and probably not all that interesting. So I thought I'd really kind of hit on some themes and some takeaways. I guess the main thing, which we've seen with some of the earnings that have come out over the past month or so, is just a lot of inability, I guess, to predict what the second half of the year is going to look like. So most retailers either lightened their guidance for the future or said they don't know. A few, though, were pretty confident that they could handle things. And I'll talk about one that I trust and one maybe I don't trust so much. So one really strong report came from Abercrombie and Fitch, which we have talked about, A&F, multiple times, because they keep posting really good results, particularly when the apparel business has not been that great for most players. They were up 8% comp, led by the Hollister brand, and they're pretty confident that the good times will continue, though they did give weaker guidance, but anyway, not kind of alarming guidance. We also saw Costco, another retailer we talk a lot about, which continues to perform very well. When you look at Walmart, Costco, and Amazon, again, this idea that the big retailers, these kind of super scale retailers, are outperforming the industry average. That was the case. Costco up 8%. So that's, 2.5 times what the average retailer has reported in the past quarter. Dick's Sporting Goods, not as strong. Of course, we talked about them last time because of their pending acquisition of Foot Locker, but a 4.5% comp. They also continue to open some new format stores. So 2 new House of Sport locations in the last quarter, 4 new Field House, which is kind of a similar concept, just smaller. So that's been good. Urban Outfitters, good numbers.
And lots of momentum.
Yeah. So, but again, I would say the pattern is, they've been able to deliver good results. Most of them have tended to talk about consumers kind of pulling forward a surge in demand to get ahead of tariffs and then expecting to see things slow down and weaken a bit. Quick shout out to Gap. Now, Gap overall had a quarter, but the Gap brand performed quite well with, I think, 6.5% comp. So the weakness there is more on the Old Navy, Athleta, Banana Republic side. The one that I thought was kind of most interesting, and also tease this a little bit because I think we'll get into this a little bit more in next week's episode with some of our special guests, is Target, which continues to flail. And if you compare Target to Walmart as kind of the most direct competitor, people might know Walmart has been posting, 4 or 5% kind of sales increases. Target was down almost 4%. So you're talking about like this 8% gap in sales performance. Now, a little bit of that can be explained by the grocery mix, but a lot of it has to be explained by execution and strategic positioning. So a lot of things going on at Target. I'm frankly surprised that Brian Cornell is still the CEO, because Target had great momentum. When we first got started in the podcast, we tended to talk about Target as doing well. Yeah. They had good momentum. They were really kind of improving their supply chain, and a lot of things were really working for them. But the last 2.5, 3 years, they've lost all that momentum and squandered any kind of advantage. So I think there's a lot more things going on, which, as I say, maybe we'll talk about next week. But that was pretty shocking. One other thing that I saw was reported, and some of this probably relates to the struggles they've had with their backlash to their DE&I initiative, is their net promoter scores have declined quite significantly. So, that's kind of a leading indicator, I think, of how you would expect a brand to perform. A couple other quick things.
And they tripped over one other thing. I don't know if you've seen on social media. You've been over in Italy, but there's a lot of pictures of they released their Pride merchandise, and all the tags had Latin on them. So they forgot.
Oh, really? No, I didn't.
Yeah, it's Lorem Ipscore. There's some hilarious pictures, stuff on the shelf for sale with Latin text. So maybe they're trying to.
Honestly, it's hard to understand what the heck's going on there. Really, I mean, I'm a little. Some of their underperformance I can explain, and some of it is just it's quite baffling. But a couple of things I'll mention quickly. The department store sector, which we arguably talk about too much, we had reports from Macy's, Dillards, and Kohl's. Kohl's, as expected, since they already, with their CEO change, they kind of flashed what their sales results were going to be, were pretty terrible, down almost 5%, I believe. Dillard's, regional player that's actually bigger than Macy's, even though Macy's gets a lot of attention. Dillard's was down about 1%, so not too terrible. Macy's also down 2 or 3%. So we really see these department store guys, despite lots of effort to try to turn things around, are really going nowhere. And I would be quite concerned about the tariff impact, because of course a lot of the product they have is imported. All these guys barely break even. So either we will see a pretty significant hit to margin to the extent they're not able to pass along price increases, or I guess some blend of trying to pass on price increases, which they might get quite a lot of resistance from the consumer on. So either way, pretty tough situation. The last retailer I'll mention quickly is Home Depot. Now, Home Depot did not have a great quarter, nor did their direct competitor Lowe's, nor did Best Buy. I mean, generally, the hard lines, big ticket guys are really struggling and have been. So no real improvement there, though their profitability is decent. But the main thing they said was they did not expect tariffs to cause them to increase prices, and they were pretty sanguine about the impact going forward. They did.
They talked about merchandising decisions, right? For example,
that they are. Well, one. Yeah, I mean, they are, compared to some, particularly a lot of apparel and home furnishings players, they have a higher percentage of product that they source from the U.S. and not quite so much in China. So they basically said that they've made a bunch of moves already to reduce their reliance on foreign goods, and they're going to continue to do that, and they're going to stop carrying some products that would impact their profitability. Now, I'm sure some of that is true. I think they mostly are. I don't want to say that I don't trust them, but I think they've seen what's happened to some retailers that have really talked a lot about how they're going to have to increase prices and gotten a lot of pushback from the president. Their founder is very famously a big Trump supporter. So I think there's a little bit of PR going on here. And I think there's a little bit of, well, we're going to buy stuff that's more expensive because it's produced in the U.S. So, we'll see how that plays out for them. But, I think prices are going up. It's just not going up because they're passing on tariffs so much.
And some of those prices might be going up for everybody, right? So one of their big vendors.
Sure.
If you look at the electric power tools, most of those, if not all, are made in China or somewhere foreign, but they would go up for everybody, right? MAP pricing kind of discussion.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I mean, we see a lot of MAP pricing. So if people aren't familiar, there's manufactured suggested prices. So they're very much suggested. Like if you don't charge that price, we suggest that you stop selling our product.
Someone else, yeah.
But anyway, legally, one might call it sort of a form of price fixing. But legally, it's a way around it. It wouldn't necessarily put them at a disadvantage. Now, if MAP pricing goes up 10 or 15%, how does that affect demand? That is a big question. Generally speaking, of course, as prices go up, you would expect demand to go down a little bit, but might not be significant. And as you say, it might not put them at a competitive disadvantage. The last thing I was going to talk about from an earnings standpoint is not a retailer, but sort of retail adjacent, which is Klarna, the big buy now, pay later guys. They had a quite disappointing quarter. They have not been making money, but they lost even more money. And they are, just as an aside, going to be delaying their planned IPO given market conditions. But of course, one of the things we need to watch going forward is, in general, the pressures on consumer credit. We were starting to see this, I kind of predicted, I think like 18 months or so ago that we'd see this sooner, and I was wrong about that. But this is perhaps an ominous sign.
I think you said sooner or later. So you said sooner or later, so I think it's working to the later part. Maybe.
Yeah, right. That's one of the things I've learned about making, as the saying goes, predictions are particularly difficult, particularly about the future. And so if you keep it very open-ended in terms of the dates, you have a little bit more wiggle room. So I am learning a few things in my old age. But anyway, that's the earnings roundup. I think, there were a couple of other just quick hits. I mentioned, I think, two of maybe the last three episodes that I had predicted for this year that we would see an increase in M&A type activity, IPOs, et cetera. And then I kind of backpedaled on that with all this tariff turmoil. But now it's looking like I might be right, even though I thought I was going to be wrong, because the deal making has not necessarily slowed down. We've had several big deals. We just talked about Dixon's and Foot Locker, but Rhode, Hailey Bieber's beauty brand, was sold for a nice, cool $1 billion to Elf Cosmetics, or ELF. So anyway,
it's an elfin good deal.
That is an elfin good deal. So if folks want to learn more about Elf, they can go back and listen to our interview with Lori Lamb from, I don't know, was that like a year or so ago? I'm losing track of time, maybe even longer. But a brand that is, continuing to grow quite quickly, and this will kind of take them into some other areas. So that's interesting. I wanted to get your perspective on what's going on with HBC, Hudson Bay Company, which looked like it was liquidating, but maybe there's a bit of new life there. What's the Canadian perspective on that, since you're definitely closer to it, literally and physically, metaphorically?
Literally and physically. I worked there for 7 years, so I have some awareness of it. It's been quite the show, really. I mean, grab some popcorn, pull up a chair, and watch this show. So basically, the Bay is dead. Long live Hudson's Bay IP. The Bay, as of today, June 1st, we're recording this on Sunday, is its last day of existence. They have sold Hudson's Bay's of close to 4 centuries of intellectual property over to Canadian Tire. Now we've had the CEO of Canadian Tire on the show, Greg Hicks. So for $30 million, they picked up all the IP, except for Zellers, their mass merch. They didn't want that. So, you might see in the future, I mean, it's a great steward for a brand, which is both historical, deeply historical in Canada. It means a lot to people. And we can debate and discuss whether that IP will be worth what it's worth today. I mean, look at what happened with Craftsman and Sears. Yeah. Nobody even knows that's a Sears IP. But in the short term, you could see some nice coolers, or, they've got a great breadth of product. You could put the Bay stripes on and product, and that would be loved by Canadians. Now, so the doors are closing today. It is liquidated and gone. Now the legal shenanigans are beginning, and you've got kind of randos coming from all places. This Chinese billionaire from British Columbia owns big malls, put in a bid and got 28 leases. We're not sure what that means. She's going to build a whole new concept department store from the ground up. Like I said, just make more popcorn and watch what that means, starting a 28 store department store from the ground up out of nothing, because it's not the Bay anymore. Can't call it the Bay, can't call it Hudson's Bay. You just have 28 places. So make a long story short, you've got about 90, including Saks. There's a couple of Saks locations included in that. You've got 90 locations. A third of those would be viable, right? I'm sure retailers of all sorts are putting in bids for a third of those. A third of those would be maybe someday they'll be filled or reworked, and a third of them, you might as well bulldoze them down. They'll never be sold. Retailers here in Canada are, it's not like a big seam of opportunity, because they weren't exactly lighting it up anyway. All their sales will just flood in different places. Retailers are worried, though, when I talk to them about the anchor at the regional mall, because there's no more shopping centers here. You've got Holtz and Simons. That's a dark corridor and a door locked to the parking lot now. So from that perspective, the story's not over, but the story of Hudson's Bay as a retailer is over, and it's sad to see, but we're going to see what happens. We're going to see what happens next.
Well, watch this space, as we like to say.
And some people have been asking me, as a segue into your next point, some people have been asking me, who would take space like that? And the first I thought of course, watching your great videos from the Wayfair store just outside of Chicago, 150,000 square feet, not exactly in the center of retail. That kind of sums up a few Hudson's Bay locations. Now, it looks like Wayfair. You made the announcement, by the way, if everybody be sure and check out our YouTube site. We've got some great videos on there, including your tour of their store. In that video, we announced they were opening a second location. Now there's news that they're opening up a third location.
Yeah, I guess they're gaining some confidence. I mean, obviously, 3 stores in the scheme of furniture retail in North America is not huge, but they're going to open a third store in Yonkers, New York, just north, right across the river from where I grew up, in Nyack, New York, but just north of New York City. So we'll see what that looks like. But next up is Atlanta. So yeah, check out those. There's 2 videos on our YouTube channel, and subscribe and share and do all that. A bunch of fun stuff up, but a lot to pack into this week's episode. So probably should leave it there.
Yeah. Now, before we leave it there, snap, and it's June already. In a couple of 3 weeks, you and I will be together in New York at the Commerce Next show. You'll be on stage interviewing Joe Kudliff from Viore. We're going to be hosting their Nexties Awards. We're doing some interviews. So if you haven't made your arrangements to go to New York City for Commerce Next, run, don't walk. Time is running out, and I'm looking forward to seeing you, my friend, in a couple of weeks. All right, now let's get to our next section, 10 tantalizing tips for tumultuous times. Well, Steve, off the top of the podcast, we were talking about a range of tumultuousness, so to speak, or a range of turmoil. It's not like retailers are not unused to dealing in very dynamic times. What in your mind makes this time and these times so different?
Well, kind of as I alluded to at the top, I think the sheer degree of uncertainty, confusion, and volatility, and I guess you could say the consequences of not responding well or responding inappropriately. I also think and we'll talk, I guess, about this in terms of one of my tips, but I also think there's a little bit of denial maybe on the part of some retailers as to how disadvantage their position is. One of the things we talked about in the beginning of the season was, particularly in the U.S., how much growth was concentrated in so few retailers. And so even before we got into this tariff turmoil, there were a lot of retailers that are having a hell of a time driving the top line. And we have a fair number of retailers whose balance sheets are kind of precarious. We've talked about a bunch of retailers going through refinancing challenges like Saks Global and Kohl's, but there are others, including quite a lot of small businesses that just don't have the financial capacity to begin with. So when you layer on top this uncertainty, when you layer on top the slowdown in spending that we're starting to see, inflationary pressures, this kind of stagflation thing, which appears to be with us, if not completely, will soon be, I think, for many, at least in North America. There's just a lot of pressures. So if you want to give yourself a chance of thriving, much less surviving, you really have to get a laser focus and be more aggressive, I think, in certain actions. The other thing I would say, just as a backdrop, which relates to what I was saying about the kind of the big getting bigger, is the strong players, those that have good momentum, a remarkable value proposition, strong balance sheet. Most of those players know that these types of situations are the time to grab market share. So if you are one of the have-nots, you're likely to get even more competitive pressure than you typically get. So that's a pretty scary scenario. So I think that calls for perhaps some different and more aggressive actions.
Well, the theme for this section of the pod isn't about chronicling all the challenges. It's about what you can do about it. Sit back and get 10 tips from your perspective about how to deal, how to get through it, how to survive and thrive, depending on where you are on the spectrum. All right, so let's get into this. Now, the caveat here that you gave me as I was reading through these, your mileage is going to vary, so to speak, right? Just as you were saying, whether you're already ahead, your size, your scale, your innovation, your location. So anyway, these 10 tips are kind of a general and apply them to where you are in the state of your business. Let's get to number 1. Make a radical commitment to reality and transparency.
Yeah, the thing I was going to say about these first two is they're kind of foundational or more big picture. As we get into the back half, we'll get a little bit more specific. But as I was alluding to as we got started here, there's a fair amount of denial that I observe, what's out in the ether, but as well as I see talking to some retailers. And, what I often say is denial is a hell of a drug. And when you're in difficult situations and you need to take bold action, I think you really need to get honest with yourself. And sometimes what I recommend is make a list of the hard, uncomfortable truths that you face. And I think you can do that from both an internal perspective, like what is really your financial situation? How are you doing with the customer, and how are you doing with the customers that are most valuable to you, as well as the ones you hope to attract or need to attract in many cases? And how are you doing on kind of every aspect of that customer journey? Are you acquiring customers at the rate you need to? And if not, why? Are you growing them? Are you retaining them? Are you getting the NPS score? So really dig down into that. The other piece, which is hard in a difficult environment, is to keep delivering innovation. And so what is the state of your innovation pipeline? And are you kind of wishing the ball into the hole, so to speak, in terms of what you can count on that for the future? And then do the same kind of thing externally, your competitive situation. What is likely to be the macro impacts? Now, again, this is particularly hard to understand that. We went into this year thinking that we wouldn't be into this state of disruption, across the whole world, but in between countries and within countries. We thought interest rates were likely to be coming down, and if anything, long-term interest rates have moved in the other direction. So, nobody has a perfect crystal ball, but try to think through those different scenarios and then address them head on. And one of the things I often say as a backdrop, and this is part of, I think, what I mean when I say denial, is most retailers find it very easy to go after costs, layoffs, cutting back on things,
store hours,
delaying, investments, closing stores, that kind of stuff. There's really very few retailers, and I don't know if this is controversial, but my experience has been very few retailers fundamentally have a cost problem. Typically, they have a sales problem, but because they haven't addressed the sales problem, they default to cutting costs. So I often say, look, if you're going to spend your energy, don't get seduced into how easy it is to fire. I mean, I don't mean necessarily emotionally easy, but how easy it seems to cut consultants and cut travel and cut hours and all that kind of stuff. Why are you losing relative market share? If you cannot really understand that question fundamentally, I don't think you're likely to make much progress.
All right, let's get to the second one, which may seem actually a little contrarian. A willing embrace of uncertainty.
Yeah, well, some of these tips, people, if they've read either or both of my books, will sound familiar. And this is one of the things I've been talking about for a while is the nature of the world, the nature of our lives is there's lots of uncertainty. So this isn't new. It's just that sometimes people, who like to be in control, like to think they're in more control than they actually are. So when we accept the things, if people are familiar with the Serenity Prayer, accept the things you cannot change and be willing to change the things that you can. Just get really clear on that. We've talked about this idea of a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. It's just, that's the way retail operates. That's the world operates. We're just kind of on steroids now. So I think accepting that and figuring out how to deal with it and getting real clear on what you can change and what you can't is very important. A lot of folks talk about the trend being your friend. So lean into things that can work to your advantage. But the underlying lesson here is building more agility into your system. I have this line, agility is the new black in Leaders Leap. And, I wrote that before we knew we were going to be in such a tumultuous time as we are now. But agility is so key, finding that nimbleness, finding ways to take action. So anyway, these first two I think are really kind of foundational. It's more attitude and more kind of cultural things you want to embed or kind of running rules that you should have in approaching a lot of decisions that you need to make today and probably frankly for the next at least 6 to 12 months.
Number 3, ABT, always be testing.
Yeah, this is another one that people familiar with my work will know. But I think in this environment, it's easy to pull back on pilots and proof of concepts and experimentation.
First thing to go, right?
Yeah, and in some cases you need to. Like I'm not suggesting you just kind of hope. Hope is not a strategy. People say hope is a decision that you lean into. So, but I think one of the ways to do more testing is to try to unlock this capacity. So how do you declutter what you're doing? Most of the times I found this when I was on the operating side, as well as in a consulting side, there's low value activity. So the sooner you can root that out, the better. But part of that is to say, okay, what could we let go of so that we can do more testing? Because again, if you don't, most companies need to do more of this anyway, but in this environment, the worst situation for you is you wake up a year from now and you don't have anything new in the pipeline. And then those, particularly the bigger players with these bigger budgets that are going after market share, they'll be that much further ahead of you. So you need to take a portfolio approach. You need to find ways to move faster. I know this is easier said than done, but I would say one tip is really find things to get rid of so you can do more investment in piloting and experimenting.
Now, in your next tip, you're channeling your good friend, Seth Godin. Choose your fans, choose your future.
Yeah, Seth wrote this quite a long time ago. I don't even remember when he first said it or wrote it or whatever, but he recently included it in one of his blog posts. And the idea of choose your fans, choose your future is really twofold. One is really getting clarity on who your business proposition is for, but even more particularly, get into what I call that passionate core. Some people will know this from Kevin Kelly's 1,000 True Fans idea or Seth's other work around tribes. But who's at kind of center of your bullseye, the people that your business is really built for, the people that are going to stay with you even when you screw up, the people that are most likely to remark on your brand and carry that story forward. So, if you think about department stores or some of these big retailers that serve a lot of different kinds of customers, a lot of different kinds of products, really zoom in on who is going to be there for you and who you could leverage the most. And then, kind of like I was saying a little bit earlier, how are you realistically doing with these 1,000 true fans? It's going to be a big number for a big retailer, but for those passionate core customers, because chances are, not only will they represent a disproportionate amount of your profitability, they will be the easiest to activate. And if you do better in acquiring them and increasing frequency and growing transactions and transaction value and retention and all that kind of good stuff, you will get a spillover effect. The problem is usually kind of aiming too widely and trying to be a little bit of everything to everybody. So this is really a time for that kind of laser focus and really unlocking those leverage points you have.
Number 5, be human-centered, digitally enabled.
So these are two, people paying attention, keeping score at home will know that these are two of my essential of remarkable retail. And I'm actually, just as an aside, spending more time on thinking about whether we have gone too far to one direction in terms of leveraging technology. This is not to say that technology is not hugely important, but this idea that a retailer is a technology company, that's silly, or that you need to be digital first, that mindset can be very helpful because obviously we are living in a digital world and we're moving to more and more things being digital. But the problem is that takes you away from making that human connection. And I've talked often, and we've talked on the podcast about the buying versus shopping, jobs versus joys kind of world. And in many cases, there are things that are very much about efficiency, and you're going to win because of speed and price. But the problem there is that kind of business. This explains a lot of what we've talked about with all the growth being captured by the Amazons and Walmarts, is that, there's only a few retailers that can really make that work. For just about everybody else, at least a good chunk of your business is going to be really about delivering the joys, that more soulful experience, connecting with people on a human level. So use technology, enable things digitally as much as you can, but stay connected to the human that's involved and finding, what is going to elevate how they feel about you. Again, some of the most valuable brands when you get beyond the Walmart and Amazon are the Hermeses of the world. People are paying an enormous premium for, yes, quality of the product and quality of service, but how it makes them feel. So find the soul of shopping, stay human. And I think that can unlock a lot of opportunities. Again, in this world where profits are tough, there's a tendency to reduce staffing. There's a tendency to cut out what are seen as frills, but often that's the thing that's going to make your brand remarkable. So you got to balance, you got to walk sort of two sides of the street here, leveraging technology, being efficient as much as possible, but don't let that take you too far in the other direction. You're likely to really lose your way.
And I'd add a footnote to this one. Take care of your people, too, because, all these things we're talking about, turmoil and stress, there's a lot of things we're not talking about that are stressful and full of turmoil around everyone. And I think it's adding up to stress in the people in your stores and the people who work for you, wherever they are. So keep an eye on your people and, stay human-centered about that. If you got to make choices around, making cuts, be human about it. But just the stress that a lot of us are under just from this overall nonstop news cycle is pretty intense, right?
Well, I think that's a great point. When I talk about human-centered, in my first book, I was very careful to say, well, it's one thing to talk about your customers, but you also need to think about your associates and the people you partner with and the communities in which you operate, because people have a strong need to be seen and to feel important. And yeah, I think you'll get more out of your not to make it so transactional sounding, but, you'll get more out of the people that are working with you. People will be more committed to the changes you're trying to make if you treat them like human beings, not just a number or somebody who's there to get a paycheck. So no, I think that's a very, very good point.
Number 6, when in doubt, tell a better story.
Well, this relates a little bit to what to the last point, but if you get beyond the very functional type of products, buying aspirin, when you have a headache, but most of the other reasons that people buy particular products and love particular brands, people buy the story before they buy the product. We buy on emotion and then we justify rationally. So just to use the Hermes example, somebody who loves Hermes will tell you part of the reason why they spend so much money on that handbag or whatever, a scarf or whatever it might be is, how well it's made and the craftsmanship and all that kind of stuff. And that's a support, but the fundamental reason is they want to be part of that brand story. So, if we look at some of the retailers that are struggling, and this is a bigger strategic point, it's less about a tip right now, but I'd say this can point you in that direction. When you think about who's the JCPenney customer, or pick any retailer that's been struggling for years, what's the story of that brand? Why is somebody a JCPenney person? And you're in your hard time coming up with anything, right? Because a lot of it is just, they have sort of okay stuff and I get a good deal and I buy it or I'm already there. There's no emotional connection. There's no story to be part of. So I think if you're struggling to acquire customers, you're struggling to get that top line moving, think about, is there a better story you can tell? Yes, you got to be more efficient. Yes, you got to have, staffing worked out well and, all that kind of stuff. But, who is it for? What's it for? And what is the thing that people will talk about to literally remark about it? So, and it's important to say, you can't cost cut or store close your way to a better story. Like that is never making, it may allow you to save some money to invest in other things, which is kind of, the Macy's strategy of focusing. But if you don't ultimately answer the story part of it, the value proposition, the reason people are going to develop that emotional connection and talk about your brand, none of this other stuff is going to add up to much. So I wouldn't lose sight of that. Again, it's a bigger picture point to a certain degree, but when you get caught up in all the cost cutting and deferring, don't lose sight of why people want to be part of your brand in the first place, or ways you can make them want to be part of your brand.
Number 7 is one of the most powerful statements I've heard in retail. Edit to amplify.
Well, I love this one. I've included it. We've talked about it on the podcast. I included it in my last book, and it's originally from Nike, but it's this idea, particularly in a world, not to get into too much of the setup for this, but in a world where we are overwhelmed by choice and overwhelmed by places to buy things and overwhelmed by marketing messages and our phones going off and everything, it's a very cluttered world. So how do you become that compelling signal amid all the noise and separate yourself from the incredible amount of choices that people have, pretty much 24/7, right? So what you can do if you're not one of these mass retailers, if you're not Amazon or Walmart or Costco or some of these people of enormous scale, how do you stop being a little bit of everything for everybody and getting lost or just making it all about price? So the way to do that, I think, is about narrowing your aim. And so in many cases, that means, rather than try to go after this big target of consumers, how do you focus that down, but then go deeper? So edit both the range of customers you're trying to serve, but also in many cases, edit the range of things you're trying to do for them. That is what makes good specialty retail. And I suspect most of the people listening, I do know we have people that listen to the podcast from Walmart and Costco and Amazon and other big retailers, but probably 90% of the listeners are not going to be able to beat Walmart or Amazon or Costco on price and not be able to do some things. So narrow your aim, find ways to boost your signal, amplify those wow experiences, those things that they can get from you in a way they can't get from the competition, and certainly not from somebody like an Amazon or a Walmart.
I love this next one. Whether you do it yourself, whether you've got mystery shoppers, or whether you just listen to the customer, perform a friction audit.
Yeah, well, one of the things I've talked about in Remarkable Retail this idea of harmonized retail, which is kind of my term for omni-channel. But the idea is that everything, regardless of whether you're, what channel or media you're interacting, all works together. And so part of that is doing what we just talked about, which is how do you amplify the wow? But there's often a lot of pain points or friction points or discordant notes or whatever you want to call it in the process. And so when you look at quick wins, a lot of times doing a disciplined audit of the customer journey, and I would do that both by, for your most valuable customers, as well as maybe people you're trying to attract, your most valuable prospects, and maybe some of the highest value purchase occasions, because, this can get to be pretty big and hairy. So you may want to, scale it down a little bit if you can't afford to do something quite, afford monetarily as well as resource-wise and time-wise. So focus it down, but really go through and see where people get hung up on the process. Now, a lot of times, of course, people will do like cart abandonment analysis or bounce rates from, and that's part of it. But there's usually more of it. So, yeah, it might be mystery shopping. There's a lot of different ways of doing it, and it depends on what kind of business you have. But, start at the beginning of the customer journey and work your way all the way through. And where do you lose people along the way? Or, may not literally lose them, but where are you not differentiating yourself relative to the competition? And one little caveat I would put on this is a lot of times the tendency is to kind of benchmark, I guess, yourself against similar competitors. But what I think we've learned over the last few years is a lot of times, your shopping cart is not being compared. If you're Home Depot, your shopping cart is not being compared to Lowe's or Home Hardware or somebody or Ace Hardware or whatever. It's being compared to the best shopping cart out there, which is probably Amazon or, somebody else. So don't think about it too narrowly, because customers' expectations are usually set by their last great experience, and that may not be and probably wouldn't be with your direct competitor. So just make sure you open the aperture a little bit in what you consider.
One of my favorite talking points when I'm doing interviews is asking retailers the difference in their world or their environment between table stakes and differentiators. And your next one, don't confuse table stakes with differentiators. So important.
I've had some battles on LinkedIn with people that basically say, all Kohl's needs to do, or all JCPenney needs to do, or all Macy's needs to do, or all HBC needed to do is blah, 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 blah. And most of the things they point to are table stakes kinds of things, not things that are going to lead to a winning strategy. Now, if you're in a dive, you need to pull out first, right? I mean, you need, you need to execute well. So what I often say is
before you get to the differentiator.
Right. So I'm not saying ignore those things. Like you have to have them, but don't think just because, we talk about, we've talked about a bunch of times, sucking less is not a winning strategy. So it can feel like progress when you address, we don't have enough salespeople on the floor, or we've got a messed up SEO strategy or whatever. We got too many, our assortment's got, too many colors and we need to be more focused. Like all those things can be very good things to do and may give you a little bit of a bump. But the reason why I'm so confident that some of these turnaround strategies are not going to ultimately be successful is they just get you to parity at best. Yeah. And one of the things I think we've learned is that and it's really fundamental to the idea of remarkable retail is shoppers in general don't switch from a retailer they like just because you're equivalent, right? And the real danger, and we see this all the time, particularly with department stores, is part of the way you get people to switch is you promote the hell out of products. So the consumer is basically saying, I don't really care whether I get this at JCPenney or Kohl's. I'll just go where I get the best deal. Which we call the promiscuous shopper. And the promiscuous shoppers don't make you money generally. So you can do all these things to close a gap, but it's not going to get you ahead. So yes, do them. Flawless execution is necessary, but it is not going to be sufficient. So if all your efforts just add up to closing the gap, things might look a little bit better, but mostly you'll do less badly. And that is not a winning strategy.
Well, we've gone through 9 amazing tips. The 10th is basically getting ready to pull the chute or the emergency exit or just the last most important thing to be focused on. When in doubt, cash is king.
At one level, this is pretty obvious. Probably the smaller business owners listening to this will be very familiar with this. I mean, we're going to unfortunately see...
They'll be eye-rolling. Yeah, at this point, they'll be eye-rolling.
But, you can have a solid, profitable business and still you find yourself in trouble. One of the things, we've talked about with the tariff situation is if you don't have a strong balance sheet and you don't have the ability to borrow a significant amount of money, you have to pay for tariffs today, and you may not sell that product and get the cash for many, many months. So it doesn't matter ultimately whether you have priced it at a solid margin and have been a good operator if you run out of cash in the meantime. So this is a great example where your mileage may vary. Folks at Walmart are probably going, whatever. I don't even think, I don't even know what our cash position is. I just know what my open to buy is, or I just know
Costco,
how I did this weekend. Yeah. So, but I think that particularly if, I guess this is more for people that find themselves with a weak balance sheet and more economic pressure in the short term, is, really, focus on that cash. You can't take a margin percentage to the bank, right?
Well, there you have it. 10 tips to keep your head above water, survive, or even maybe thrive. An episode right for the times. Let's leave it there. Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Season 10 are available each and every Tuesday, so be sure and tell all your friends in the retail industry all about us. And make sure and visit our newly refreshed YouTube channel for exclusive video and our new virtual store tours. If you liked our episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts.
And I'm Steve Dennis, strategic advisor, keynote speaker, and best-selling author of 2 books, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, and Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at StephenPDennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant and advisor, keynote speaker, and media entrepreneur. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.